3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of what the previous speaker mentions is valid, but it's a lot of fear-mongering. If you think about what truly has happened over the past 50 years with any kind of technology, people had said the same thing. People were also worried about access to the internet. People were worried about smartphones. People were worried about self-driving cars. People were worried about chatbots and large language models. We think, for the very reasons they said, that these things are inevitable, that these things are growing, is precisely the point in which we don't want to get in our own way and ultimately make a lot of these life-changing and beautiful technologies less accessible to people at the point in which the government makes it harder to be able to access and consume these things. A couple of points of framing in the top of my speech. Number one, this is a value judgment debate about the extent and presupposition of regulation. Make no mistake, this is not a debate about regulation being good or bad, or whether AGI in itself is good or bad. Gov has a burden to nuance it to the slowdown and or putting a higher barrier to be able to produce, consume, and distribute those particular things. While we on opposition are going to prove why we want to be able to at least make it the same, or even take a higher burden of saying we want to make it even faster because the previous speaker said it's inevitable. My intuition pump is, why delay the inevitable? If the United States already has an advantage, they have to be able to milk it, and they need to be able to box out competition and be able to put a premium on the innovation they already have. The second part of framing is, what do we mean by not impose regulation? We think we're still going to, of course, have a governing body and certain sets of domestic and international law, but we want to be able to democratize production, consumption, and distribution inside the US and outside the United States for the rest of the world. What does that look like? A, it means by creating a flow of capital that actually comes in the United States to be able to make these particular GPUs and technology. This refers to production. B, creating an incentive structure for people to be able to want to switch to be able to buy it. Meaning, instead of using archaic software as a service models or internet service providers and stuff, you want to be able to make that shift out of narrow AI towards these AGIs that are actually faster and better, that improve quality of life and make decisions ultimately faster. This refers to consumption, ladies and gentlemen. And C, by making the distribution of such, the import and export of these goods inside the US and outside, just better, bolstering the GDP of the US, and as a consequence, given that they're the biggest economy in the world and the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, it just makes it more accessible, ladies and gentlemen, similar to smartphones. Given how the US government treated things like cars and smartphones, even people in the poorest of the poor parts of Southeast Asia or the poorest of the poor parts of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America had access to these particular things. What are the goals we want on our side? Here are 3 metrics we should use to weigh this debate. Number 1, how can the United States secure the position as a first mover and be able to make the most out of the advantage they already have? Similar to how, if you think of big tech and the Mag 7, the biggest companies in the world like Facebook, Meta, Netflix, Amazon, Nvidia, you think of United States. The point in which you put fetters on those particular technology make it harder for them to be able to stay relevant and as a consequence become less accessible. Yeah, go for it.
If the United States already dominates within this market, then I will use the same premise to actually challenge that premise. If the US is currently dominating the market and the development of AGI is inevitable, then why the rush?
Because contrary to popular belief, good things can become bad and your market share can become less. Meaning, if the US gets in their own way of producing GPUs, that is the point in which they lose market share to the likes of China, to the likes of other nefarious actors who might not have democratic interest in mind. If your rhetoric is, Joseph, magaling na, they're doing it so well, why should they be able to put these things in place? Why get in their own way? You have to prove why someone who is already a leader and has that economic advantage of economies of scale would want to make that slower. It's like making it harder to do something you're already good at. That's particularly harmful. Later, the second thing is being able to bolster your domestic market, wherein players, big or small, are able to compete and do better. And thirdly is international access to be able to allow people to get those particular things. Let's respond to a couple of things we get from the previous speaker. The first thing they talk about is how jobs get wrecked and it becomes inaccessible. My response here is very simple. Since the advent of things like narrow AI, like LLMs and chatbots and all of these models, it just made access to these things so much easier and more prevalent. It created more jobs for coders, more jobs for people to be able to sift through content. And yes, we're willing to bite the harm that jobs might change and there's a learning curve nuance. But in the long run, just gut check this. It just opens up the access when people are more productive and you're able to do more things. Similar to how smartphones became more accessible when you didn't inhibit it, but you democratized access. Secondly, is how, people can't think anymore. Bro, we're doing the most thinking now because we don't anymore have to be concerned with the Maslow's hierarchy bullshit in the bottom end of the spectrum. People who are stupid or not the most academically gifted can now literally write faster and better that just make the quality of life and quality of input on average better. It's out of order already. And then lastly, in terms of the idea of how, it particularly makes it worse for technology at the point in which it becomes just too accessible, it's an eventuality, and we rather stay ahead of the curve as opposed to the curve leading us, and we need to be able to democratize access. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to stand on side opposition.